And we are now recording on video. Hey, everyone on YouTube. You are about to witness us recording an episode of our audio podcast, Never Stay Dead. I almost said everything stay dead.
Well, that's very cynical.
Yes. Stay dead, please. At least Donald Trump's hopes for the White House. Stay dead, please.
We'll come back around to that.
One of the things I was just saying I haven't been reading comics very much, is I've been reading Michael Cohen's book about his life with Donald Trump, the ex-lawyer of Donald Trump who went to jail for giving money to the porn star.
Oh.
How his actions are worthy of going to jail if Donald Trump's aren't, I never understood, but I haven't got to that part of the book yet.
Okay, well, there you go.
But I shouldn't get political on YouTube. That's probably the worst place this is the worst place to get political.
We're going there tonight, buddy. It's unavoidable with this book.
That's true in a way, yeah. Okay, I'm gonna start things off with hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Never Stay Dead. I am Damian, and I am joined by my handsome friend Matt.
Oh.
But so how have you been doing, Matt?
I am okay.
Okay. It is COVID. We're all trapped in whatever little lives we've got. But we're reading a big, expansive book today called, or we have read and we're going to discuss, The New Frontier by Darwyn Cooke, written and illustrated by Darwyn Cooke, with color by Dave Stewart, a favorite colorist of many people. And what else is there to say? It was originally printed in single issues in 2004, and then I think in 2005 it made it into some paperback trades or something. I think that's where I originally read it, and and then it's been in a bunch of hardcover iterations. I'm looking at the absolute edition here, and Matt may have read it in a hardcover deluxe version.
I did. Thank you for sending that my way. That made
yes, I had both. And I wasn't happy with the deluxe version. It wasn't deluxe enough.
Oh.
It had bad binding. So I don't feel like I've given you that great of a gift.
It's fine by me. A little bit of the gutter loss just doesn't bother me as much.
And of course, it is completely available on the DC Universe app, which I also have up on the screen here for the people watching in video. So I picked it because I remembered it as one of the most brilliant superhero comics I'd read in ages when I read it back in 2005. And I think I overrated it a bit back then. It's kind of at the moment being considered a bit of a classic. Like my edition is the 15th anniversary edition. And like I said, there's been various hardcover versions. But so, Matt, you weren't sure if you'd read it or just seen the movie previously?
Yeah, I definitely hadn't read it. I had seen the animated adaptation before, and I watched that again as we were preparing for this. And it's funny because I definitely remember it being heralded as, one of the greats. And there's a lot in this book to like. There's a lot of just like comic craftsmanship. There's a lot of thoughts and ideas. There's a lot of interesting take on DC lore. There's a lot of good stuff in this book. And I kind of want to preface what I'm saying because I'm going to be fairly critical of a number of parts of this book. And I think that's in large part due to the fact that I'm reading this in 2020. If, I had read this in 2004, I think it would have read differently. I'm also thinking I'd be reading it as a high schooler, which might be part of it. I think reading it post-college might be part of the criticism because this book opens itself up to some higher-minded criticism that I think it fails at in certain points, and we'll get there.
But I first read this in my 40s, so I don't have that excuse. And I'm not saying it's a bad book. I'm just saying it's not the great book that I somehow had pictured it as. in my head after reading it. Years later, I just looked back on it.
I just want to say, like, overall, I think this is a worthy read. I totally think it's worth checking out. You can't deny that there's a lot of greatness here, but it falls short. It falls short with some of the messages and themes and even artistry. So good, not great. It's a complicated read. It's an interesting one. I'm glad we're doing it, but it's never going to be my favorite or anything. This is very much a mixed bag for me.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've been saying that a lot.
I felt it was a mixed bag in terms of its success in just storytelling techniques and the like.
Yes.
Let me just really quickly kind of spoil the whole book for those.
Good luck.
I'm always trying to recap books quickly, but I would say this book is supposed to take place between the end of the golden age period of superheroes, when comic book superheroes were really popular, and then they kind of went away and there was just war and romance and horror comics. And it's sort of like giving a, quote, real world in the DC world reason for that happening, which kind of resembles Watchmen, that superheroes were made illegal. Mm-hmm. And so for a long time, they were in the shadows or inactive completely. And then it gives a series of events which somehow tie into like the space program and all of the Kennedy idealism that brings back the superheroes up in an adventure that leads up to the first issue, it was an issue of Showcase that featured the Justice League of America, the first mm-hmm. Justice League of America comic. It's literally supposed to lead up to that. Right. And it shows us, it's like a tapestry, which makes it really hard to summarize, a tapestry of different characters and different events in that intervening period, starting with Dinosaur Island and moving through John Jones, the Martian Manhunter, arriving on Earth and his life on Earth before he decides to become a superhero, and the adventures of Hal Jordan before he becomes Green Lantern, when he's this odd pacifist Air Force pilot and sort of failed test pilot who gets a job with a secret project at Ferris Airlines. Those are just a few. We get snatches of Batman and Wonder Woman and Superman. Wonder Woman and Superman, in a sense, have become like Dr. Manhattan in Watchmen, where they're the two legal superheroes who are sent out on missions for the U.S. government. And some of them turn out to be questionable, especially to Wonder Woman. And we get little flashes of a black hero who's trying to fight back against the KKK. That's a pretty hard one to chew on in this book. And then eventually we build up to the Martian Manhunter's origin, so to speak, and Hal Jordan, Green Lantern's origin, the House, Wonder Woman, and Superman kind of change their attitudes or their approach to things, and how Batman and Robin get back involved. And who am I missing in that mix of that tapestry?
The only one I'm not sure you mentioned was the Flash.
Yes, there's a bit of the Flash. They don't actually go into his origin. He's kind of there and then decides to retire and then comes back. There's a little bit on his origin, I guess.
I mean, it's not so much his origin, but his presence as a hero that wasn't as established coming up is more we'll get there.
We also, we have the Losers, which were a war comics group, a more obscure one. We also have the Suicide Squad, which were also a war comics kind of group before the Superhero Suicide Squad, and we have the Challengers of the Unknown. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that, we'll backtrack in a minute back to issue 1, but I'll just say, and maybe you can give your opinion too, a lot of that is not terribly deeply explained. So if you don't already know who all these characters are, it can be pretty tricky. I did not know who that Flag guy is, Colonel Flag, but he plays a major role. And another guy, King Faraday, So I don't know where those characters come from, but I assume they're part of deep DC lore.
I remember Colonel Flag from like the Timmyverse cartoons, but what he was in relation to these comics that they're based on, I don't know.
And for those who aren't familiar with Darwyn Cooke, he has this style that's kind of, I don't know, a cross between those Bruce Timm kind of cartoons and Jack Kirby and Alex Toth and a lot of other sort of classic, very deceptively simple looking art styles. And everything in the comic is done, or 90% of the comic is done in these widescreen panels, 3 wide panels per page.
Right. And as much as I can enjoy that deceptively simple art style when it comes to superheroes, when we're between all those military groups we mentioned, and it's a lot of stern, square-jawed men,
right?
Telling them apart was one of the big failings for me, because I'm already struggling to keep these people, juggled in my mind, and they all look identical.
I think that is the book's big visual flaw. It has many, many visual delights, but it is, and it hurts the storytelling that it is often hard to picture. It's hard to even know which one's Hal Jordan and which one is Flag, or whatever. Mm-hmm. It can become very difficult. And one of the characters in the first section is a American Indian, but he looks identical to everybody else. Mm-hmm. So sometimes I was unsure which character, like there was a narration over, and it took me a long time to realize that narrator in the first section of the book was Lieutenant Cloud, or whatever his name was, the Indian member of the Losers.
That's fair.
And at first I thought, because I'd forgotten the plot to this, such as it is. So now we're looking at the first issue, and it takes place on Dinosaur Island, or that's what I call it. I'm not Island of the Lost or something. There was a whole series in weird war magazines where soldiers would get shipwrecked on this island with dinosaurs and have to fight them. Mm-hmm. And so the Losers, who are a different war series, end up on the Dinosaur Island having their final adventure. And I thought, this is just a random story. So it goes, big spoiler, this island is part of a giant monster that eventually wants to wipe humanity off the earth, and has been kept a life alive on Earth during the sort of pseudo-nuclear winter that was created by an asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs.
Well, besides the threat, the bigger thing is the Losers are out there to save Flag. So
Flag.
That's kind of our connection when it comes around to the end, because Flag plays a major part in kind of essentially coming back.
Right, here. That's true. That's true. That's sort of like our introduction to Flag, sort of.
Yeah, it just doesn't. It's weird. Well, it's super weird because this is almost prologue, and
yes.
Not
it's
just
a very
prologue.
Long prologue, right? Maybe 40 pages or something.
Right, but in that, we're kind of dealing with the only in World War II moment of the book, and everything about this is being post World War II in this kind of Cold War Vietnam era, before we come to the new frontier, the new era, the Kennedy era.
Right.
So that makes it being prologue even weirder with Flag, because that means Flag is old.
Yes.
But he's not depicted like that.
Well, that's true. But say he was 25 in 1945, by 1962, that's that's 17 years later. He's not too old, but he doesn't seem to age. Certainly, no one looks their age or ages in this comic.
I'm not saying he should be a geriatric. I'm just saying he should be old enough to be distinguished from all the other characters.
I agree. But maybe one could argue that Darwyn Cooke is playing with comic book history, and these characters never age, so he's not aging them.
You could, but I feel like he's represented as a bygone era in comparison to Hal Jordan later in the book. And so by making him older, that actually furthers the story through visual storytelling.
Yeah.
So,
yes, it would have helped the storytelling.
And also just being able to tell these people apart.
Yes,
but yeah.
Yes, it would have helped that, yes. And yeah. So, I mean, I guess when you look at this whole thing, he's not dealing fairly with the whole concept of age, because Batman was around during the wartime era, apparently. And it's
Batman,
still,
Superman, and Wonder Woman, in the Depression come up and continue. Yeah.
And he's still active by 1962. And unlike Superman and Wonder Woman, where you could kind of imagine they don't age at the rate the rest of us do, Batman would then already be, 50 or something, or late 40s. It would be pretty hard to do what he does by that time. But
he is Batman. Also, he's the only one operating like Rorschach did in Watchmen, I guess.
Right.
Kind of.
He's kind of the Rorschach character, yeah.
Which that's a terrible comparison. It's just that there's a law in outlawing superheroes and Batman is operating. I don't think there's a comparison beyond that.
Right. Well, so I both appreciated and was deeply frustrated with Cooke's approach by kind of doing, I mean, it's maybe linear through time, but kind of a non-linear story that just jumps around without explaining why we're looking at these different bits and pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And then all those bits and pieces come together sort of by the end to explain how we led up to this kind of new age of superheroes that was more optimistic than things had been for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But so he kind of, and it's kind of a clever taking comic book history where comics were kind of a bright, had a bright, fun future during the golden age of comics up through the wartime. And then shortly after the wartime, they became grim and dark for the most part. And then they went through their own economic collapse and dark times before kind of coming back with the Silver Age, the optimistic Silver Age of comics.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, in our current sort of debates about the right way to view the world, the Silver Age was a more scientific, science fictional age of comics. I don't know if Darwyn Cooke was thinking about that, but
I mean, it's not really in this book, but this book is much more politically focused and like to the times focused, I guess. So, that's not where this book goes.
I mean, I think he wants to link this new optimism to civil rights and to the opening up of society. He doesn't, go into things that were happening with women or sexuality during that period either. But I think he's kind of thinking of all those things and wanting to just slightly link them to the world of superheroes.
Right. But I mean, he doesn't bring that up partially because there weren't any superheroes to represent that or any DC characters to represent that, which, yeah.
Right. He makes up this John Henry character. I don't know if I can find him easily.
That's much later in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so John Henry was something that bugged me because really his only inclusion in the book is actually when Martian Manhunter is disguised as a detective and looking into cases in the area involving these kinds of people. And so John Henry looks very much like Hangman in The Watchmen, black guy, noose around his neck, kind of carrying a hammer though. And he gets into this scuffle with some white supremacists that did him and his family wrong. They burned his family alive. And in there, this entire time he's only in it for like, I want to say 5 pages. it's
Well,
being
his story
narrated.
reappears here and there throughout the tapestry, I think.
I think it's mentioned, but there's only really one big section that with him, to my recollection.
You'll have to understand as we flip through this story is 400 plus pages long, so it's very hard to find the little bits that we're talking about.
Well, there's technically chapters, but and on page 182 is kind of the part. You're right, it is broken up. Sorry, I'm taking, but it was 3 pages, and there's like 3 pages later. Okay, 6 pages. But so it's narrated. John Henry doesn't get to talk. We don't ever get to see him in relation to the other characters. He is just an element in here. He's representing 2 things. A, he's representing African Americans because he's the only one.
Right.
And he's also representing that this is happening elsewhere in America because really DC, despite not being Marvel and having it made up places, are all coastal. And so if you look at the DC map, they're all East Coast,
right,
in these very populated areas, which you could make, your assumptions of what those cities are probably like, but they're predominantly white. And
it's like he threw in this social issue without really knowing how to really connect it to all these white superheroes.
Right. And
he wanted there to be some kind of connection.
Well, yeah, and and so in preparing for us talking about this, I also watched some videos. One of the videos was made by a very prominent comic skater talking about how this showed the grim, gritty side of, the era that we're talking about, and how Darwyn Cooke wasn't shying away from anything and not brushing over anything, quote unquote, the way SJWs do, of course. But what really bothered me is that this is so much their way to tackle racism in comics is you pay it lip service and then you go away from it. Because the problem of the way that John Henry's included here is that he never meets any of the white characters. He never gets to step into the new frontier. Black heroes are not accepted into the glorious new future. They were never even really a part of the story to begin with. They were an element happening elsewhere that's for other people to worry about. Right. And these scenes include the most vulgar and gut-wrenching stuff in the comic. It's the most brutal and grim, including a rejection of innocence from a little girl who utters the word that you shouldn't say. Yeah, to call him out to the people trying to kill him. And it's...
Right, he dies because of the innocent little girl calling over the Ku Klux Klan to kill him.
Yeah, and it's clumsy.
It's clumsy. I don't see how Comicsgate type people could claim him. He was trying his best to somehow link some movement towards social justice to the early Justice League, which had no black members, of course, and never dealt with those issues. Those issues only were dealt with in DC, about 10 years after the reforming of the Justice League of America but not by the Justice League of America, by the Green Lantern in those Denny O'Neil Green Lantern issues around 1970.
Right. Well, the reason why
time DC dealt with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, this is exactly how they want this sort of situation talked about, which I think speaks to how clumsily it was handled.
Well, yeah, and I know his wife refuted them and said Darwyn Cooke was not one of them and would be disgusted by them.
Right.
But in terms of not shying away from the grim and grittiness, he doesn't shy away from the fact that a lot of these people are probably pretty awful, especially Flag and some of the people in running the Challengers and all of that kind of stuff. It's a weird juxtaposition of this cartoony, simple, pure kind of art with kind of a world that is not that functional and fairly unjust. Well, and it's kind of creating that world and trying to then at the end wedge it into the innocent world of 1962 Silver Age or whenever that showcase first came out, is a push. It doesn't really match.
Well, to counter that you're saying, though, I think the sections with Wonder Woman, in particular Wonder Woman and Superman, kind of counter that and actually handle it pretty deftly, because Wonder Woman calls it out on the face and says, like, you know, what we're doing with the American government is wrong. And we're introduced to Wonder Woman when she had a bunch of female soldiers in, I believe it's Vietnam.
Yeah, I think it's Vietnam.
Rise up and essentially slaughter the men that were abusing them.
Right.
And Superman takes issue with this because she's basically called in and had a bunch of women murder a bunch of men for something that wasn't sanctioned.
Right. He only wants to do things sanctioned by the U.S. government.
But that doesn't not include not killing, which is kind of un-Superman to begin with, which is interesting, but we're kind of skating around the fact that they helped the war effort in World War II, so they probably did, right?
Right. Although the traditional view of the Golden Age is that they couldn't really send Superman or Wonder Woman off to fight the Nazis, so they were the two heroes who didn't fight the Nazis. They sent off heroes.
Real heroes, Marvel heroes, right?
Like Captain America, ones that weren't super overpowered, so you would not wonder why the Nazis weren't defeated tomorrow.
Right.
But overall, you know, Wonder Woman. So yeah, Wonder Woman's another one along with that John Henry type story that has a conscience and is talking about a better world, but it doesn't really line up with our end point. Where with Wonder Woman as the token woman in the Justice League of America, you know, so that the problem is he's trying to put all this stuff in that he then can't do anything with because his endpoint doesn't allow for it.
Well, so I feel like this book is to try to talk about a transition between two periods. You have the Great War, or not really the Great War, but sorry, I'm forgetting World War II. The Great War is technically World War I, but at this point, wouldn't they just be considered one war?
Not quite.
Yeah, not quite. And then we're in this weird moral gray period, but the idea is by the end of this book, we're moving into this new, better age because we're all going to push for that better tomorrow and not idly sit by against the problems of the recent past. But in that, you're right, where Wonder Woman ends up fights at, but I also wouldn't believe that the Wonder Woman of this book would become a secretary. You know,
right.
It's a bit revisionist, but it's also avoiding that fact.
Right. I mean, we've got some characters who are seeing that the world's a dark place and they come together at the end and they're going to try to make a better world. But really what they're going to do is fight giant aliens. So it just kind of undermines itself because they fight a monster from Earth that's like a giant alien. And that monster was super cool and was I thought it was like a Jack Kirby times 1,000 in its imaginative, grotesque, disturbing monsterness. Mm-hmm. And then in the first issue of the Justice League, they fight Starro, who's kind of a bizarre outer space giant monster. Mm-hmm. So I don't know.
There's some symmetry. It's not always perfect, but
yeah,
I think it's elevating the high points and ignoring the low points.
As an excuse for Darwyn Cooke to draw some amazing scenes, and as you say, he's best when he's drawing superheroes. Maybe because you can keep them all apart by their outfits. I mean, there's just some stunning stuff. And that I forget what they call the monster itself, like the Center. That was not a great name for a monster. But that battle scene against the monster was just super cool, and the envisioning of what the monster looked like on the inside, and its skin that was covered with thousands of other monsters. And it was super impressive to me.
Right. Well, I mean, and I'd argue Cthulhu-esque.
Yes, it is. It's kind of Cthulhu meets Jack Kirby is how I sort of experienced it. Like his apocalypse kind of scenes and stuff. But yeah, it was a strange journey. Bits and pieces that Darwyn Cooke wanted to put together, but perhaps didn't quite fully succeed in putting together.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, this is definitely a tapestry book that you're meant to take your time with and kind of piece everything together, because there's a lot of clues throughout this book, but it's not even strictly a mystery. There's
Right.
a lot of thoughts and ideas. There's a lot of reference, and it's interesting, but it's pulling from a lot of different areas all at once, and it's interesting, it's compelling, but it's fragmented. Yeah.
And along with the fragmentation, I think the other thing that bothered me most was it kind of for the most part utilized a kind of decompressed style, with a lot of panels with a little bit of words, and then every once in a while a total info dump where there's so many words to read on the page, and it was like this huge shot, and the words weren't really deeply integrated with the pictures. Do you know what I mean? There were every once in a while, so it was suddenly like, okay, now you need to download all this text after getting used to this kind of leisurely, not too heavily worded rhythm.
It's funny.
I think those really bothered me more than they should have, I think. But it was like, oh God, I hit points where I thought, I don't like reading this book. I'm just kind of bored and struggling.
It's a curse with comic artists when they take up writing. They get to these parts where they just want to do info dumps and like just write so much on the page, but past what's good writing.
Yeah.
And it seems to happen with every major artist doing their own writing, and this book didn't escape it.
True. Although I'm trying to think if that's every artist doing that. There are some exceptions. Did Frank Miller ever do that? Or
I thought he did in some of his earlier like Daredevil stuff. Like there's some clunky passages where he info dumps, but it's more to his benefit though, because he gets some brilliant Frank Miller like splash pages in return for it, and also doesn't feel as bad because they're very issue based early on. So there's like a page that there's a lot of text on, but it doesn't pop out as bad. But like Jim Lee, when he does Wildcats on his own for the first time, like it's walls of text for no gosh for dang reason. You think working under Claremont, he would have picked up a thing or two.
Right. I wonder, there may be an extent to they aren't as experienced as storytellers, and so they haven't figured out how to weave all the information into the story. So they just get to a point where, okay, I've just got to tell the audience all these ideas I have that will explain things in the background.
Yeah. Good guess.
So yeah, I found it, that's part of what I didn't remember, what an uneven read it was. And I have a feeling back in 2005, I was reading it for the art, and I've maybe changed as a reader, where I expect more from writers from the writing of comics than I used to.
Well, it could be that. I also find often when I go back and read something, if I was reading in like issues, which I don't know if you were or not.
When in 2005, I was reading more trades.
Well, no, I meant, did you read this in issues initially?
No, I think I read it in the 2 paperback volumes, which I probably got out of the library.
Yeah, it's sometimes the first time you read, you glance over a lot and you're just kind of trying to take in the basic plot. And if you read it again, you dig a little deeper and, find a different. And in a book like this, I think it's going to take more than one read to really soak it all in, because there's a lot here.
Right. And it has a there's a fun aspect of, ooh, look how he's connecting all these different little pathways of the DC universe, and he's kind of connecting them together, and he's giving especially with like the Martian Manhunter and Hal Jordan, he's giving a deep sort of prehistory of these characters. And he's evoking an art visual ideal of an older age of comics that is perhaps better than the original that the ideal was based on in terms of the visuals. So it's like a hyper nostalgic experience, like an artificial nostalgic experience in a way.
Right. But I think part of the reason that this is so seminal is because of that, right? Like, this is kind of their counter to Watchmen with all their ready-made characters for you to enjoy, but it ends on the bright, shiny future, pushing things forward, and it isn't, essentially a kick down of everything DC represents, but lifting it up and finding the fun in it.
And I wonder, I should have, I guess, looked, but I didn't look to see if there's interviews with Darwyn Cooke about his intentions. But I wonder if he did think of it as kind of taking the challenge of Watchmen and trying to play it into a more optimistic spin.
Yeah, because the time frame makes sense to me, because like 2004-ish, 2005-ish, in the area, this is about the time when comics were going through some sort of age shift, right? Like Ultimate Comics had come out, the code was being dropped wholesale. Coloring and publishing was changing, and just kind of like there's a lot of movements and new ideas happening, and some new creative really coming in. It was more subtle, but I think it was a changing moment for comics, and this being a good look back and kind of summary to press forward.
Yeah, I kind of think of that period as being when superhero comics started embracing more the writer-centric Vertigo approach to things to a degree. I know you can't really compare the Marvel's Ultimate Comics to Vertigo, but there was, to me, a feeling of that approach more than the older kind of Stan Lee or then the 90s Image guys kind of approach to superheroes, that suddenly there was a desire for more layers and textures. And even though that had been done in Watchmen and in some of the other comics sort of on the edges of comic books, of superhero comics, like The Authority and stuff, it was becoming more and more a mainstream thing to do.
Well, and comics were starting to be thought of differently, especially superheroes, because you're getting the initial bursts of the movies and stuff coming through.
True.
And you had the people brought up on the 90s cartoons that were hugely successful, either continuing or dropping with comics. And so trying to maintain that, which would be about their core audience at the time, led to some moments, but that was more Marvel. I'm trying to remember. So around this time you had like Hush and what's that Superman one? Forever Tomorrow.
The Tim Sale Superman?
Nah, well, was that around then? For All Seasons? I was thinking of the Jim Lee.
Wasn't that kind of a failure?
For Tomorrow.
Superman for Tomorrow.
I think critically in our minds it's something of a failure, but I remember it being the big like Superman story of the time, because they pushed it so hard.
And I would think at that time you also were beginning to have the rise of writing for the trade, of writing for a much longer story, because you were now pretty sure that most of the individual issues were going to end up collected.
Yeah, trades were definitely like the driver of the industry at this point.
Right. And so Darwyn Cooke's definitely, thinking in terms of this big tapestry and not worrying about if an individual issue doesn't fully
Yeah.
tell a story. But in a way, it seems like he lost control of it a bit, and he wasn't able to bring all his parts together into he had a beginning point and an end point, and then a lot of pieces in the middle, some of which pointed to his end point and some didn't really.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe it didn't matter because he was doing peak Darwyn Cooke art with peak Dave Stewart colors.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've seen the individual issues because they're 64 pages long. They must have been like mini graphic novels themselves.
Yeah, I think they're like prestige, kind of like a
Mhm.
Dark Knight Returns
Yeah.
kind of vibe there. But yeah, I mean, there's just so much that happens, and it's funny because like it's talked about, but I don't think Green Lantern's even really the main character here. But we don't even see Abin Sur, like the Green Lantern stuff, really till we're
It
most
feels
of the way
like
through the book.
Feels like maybe we had 50 or 60 pages of Hal Jordan before we got to Evans. I'm not sure, but it feels like the two biggest stories were Martian Manhunter and Hal Jordan.
Right. And I think Flash is I feel like Flash is a bigger component, even though he may not have as many pages. I feel like he represents and does a lot by being there. He also has most of the best scenes in this book.
Yes, a superhero type of scenes.
Yeah.
But he's not his life, who he is as a person is only explored for a page or two versus the many pages on those other guys. And then the other really long sequence is that first sequence on Dinosaur Island.
But the only like fun of the age superhero scene we actually really have, I think, that isn't really connected to the overall plot is the Flash one where he's fighting Mr. Freeze.
You're right.
And
like the scenes between Diana, Wonder Woman, and Superman are more them talking. They're the aftermath of things, or a scene of them with Eisenhower being given a medal.
Right. And I mean, there is a scene with Batman and Martian Manhunter where they're saving a child from the cult that is possessed by the big bad.
That's true. And that was a cool scene too.
It is, but it's so unlike the comics of the time.
Well, true. But there was no Martian Manhunter at that time. This is the hidden secret history of Martian Manhunter. I don't think he had appeared. So this is like a story that, the secret history of the DC universe.
When was he introduced?
I don't know the history of Martian Manhunter. I have to say I'd have to Google that right now. But no.
Fake geek grandpa. Come on.
I'm failing as a geek grandpa. I don't know much about Martian Manhunter at all.
I'm not sure there's a ton to know, is there?
But that strikes me that he was created in 1955. So, I'm wrong. In Detective Comics.
Yeah. He was in the Silver Age, then he's in the Bronze Age, yada yada.
So he was created right at the beginning of the Silver Age.
Okay.
But
Alex Ross drew him, so you knew he had to be from this period because he wouldn't touch a character that wasn't.
In a way, large portions of this book are extremely sophisticated fan service. It's like, ooh, beautiful scene with the Flash. Cool background on John Jones and how he slowly integrated himself into Earth society. Little extra scenes about the challengers of the unknown that you never saw before, and that kind of stuff, and the secrets of Dinosaur Island.
Mm-hmm.
So, and on that level, I think I probably responded to it back in 2005, probably as I was. Because if that's the same time as the Ultimate Marvels, that's around the time that I was dipping back into the world of superheroes. I discovered Planetary around 2000, 2001. And then I went into the comic stores and I was looking for more Warren Ellis, and I found the Ultimates and the Ultimate Fantastic Four because Warren Ellis was reading it, and other bits and pieces, and then stumbled across this after a while.
Oh, so this was part of your road back into the
Kind
addiction.
of. I didn't. So I dipped back in and I became back into superheroes, and I started going to comic book stores a little more. But I still mostly was drawing on books I could find at the library, and I was in the middle of big career changes and stuff. So I was not heavily spending my time on comics. It was just sort of a dipping in and out kind of thing at that particular time.
Just probably healthier than anything I'm doing anyways.
Well, and then I became unhealthy around 2010, and 2010 till now has been sort of nonstop overkill on comics.
Yeah.
As can be witnessed on my YouTube channel, where I have over 700 videos.
Yeah, I think I'm almost done with my year of pain with comics. I think I have one more run I have to buy.
Your year of pain?
Yeah. I've been.
You mean painful spending?
Yeah, I've bought pretty much every Spider-Man, X-Men, and Green Lantern book after a point. And
I chalk that up to COVID therapy.
Yeah. If it didn't start last November, that would be completely. Well, that was a lot of it, though. Yeah, I've
always been buying. I've been building up in terms of buying these expensive hardbacks like this Absolute Edition. But since COVID hit, I've been ordering more and more of them online. It's just like this. You need some kind of release valve because you feel like there's so much you can't do.
Right. Yeah, I hear you.
So anyway, it's funny because it's such a big, complex book. It's almost like there's less to say about it because there's no through line that we can really follow.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's other parts I want to dig on. I mean, one thing to note is like the animation is much more focused on Carol and Hal and building that relationship and what that means. But
animated movie, which I haven't seen. Is that what you mean by the animation? Yeah. Okay. I thought for a second you meant the art, and then I
no.
Does the animation capture the feel of this art and colors?
I mean, more or less. I mean, Darwyn Cooke and Bruce Timm worked together before, and so it leans more Bruce Timm, understandably, but I feel like this feels and looks different. But it's an interesting adaptation because it's mostly pure. It's like they take the parts of the book they want, they alter some things slightly, mostly because they're removing parts, so they have to kind of gel
for the parts they moved.
Yeah, but by and large, it's a pretty straight, faithful adaptation. I'm sure if you really dug through, you'd find some more changes, but yeah, it's not great. The book's stronger.
Yeah, it feels like the book, as I'm flipping through it as you're talking, is a great book for dipping into. You dip in, read the scene with the Flash versus Mr. Cold or Captain Cold, whatever he's called, in this fancy casino, and then you dip into a scene of Superman and Wonder Woman having a chat on Paradise Island, or in the skies above Paradise Island because he's not allowed to go there. And so I think I will return to this book, but probably I don't know when I will reread the whole story again.
That's
so
fair.
It is for me kind of fan service. It's like, ooh, here's a really ultimate cool scene for this character or that character.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of fun like pages and stuff, and it's interesting. But yeah, I think you're right. Dipping is almost more fun, and I know I've heard this described, since it does focus more on Hal Jordan, as kind of a different take on the Green Lantern origin, which if you were reading it for that, it would suck. I would say definitely Emerald Dawn is a million times stronger. So
yeah, I guess if you're interested in Darwyn's take of what kind of person the Green Lantern is, I mean, also as a veneer over all of this is Darwyn Cooke's love for this era, which perhaps he feels guilty about, and why he stuck in the parts about the Ku Klux Klan is because it was a great era for some white men, but he loves it. He loves that Frank Sinatra Rat Pack. I mean, kind of stuff. And
Well,
so Hal Jordan is one of those kind of post-war rat pack kind of dudes with his his smooth relationship with Carol Ferris and all that stuff.
well, and I mean, you have to remember,
and that's fun.
Well, it's fun, and it's the part that was presented, right? Like if you're a kid reading the comics and the stories you remember and you have emotional attachment to, that's the part people talked about. That's where it was. They didn't show the horrible, dirty side of things,
right?
And I mean, as we learn more and more now, that's just what it was. People weren't talking about the stuff happening, but at the same time, like if you're talking superheroes and having fun with it, yeah, like that wasn't part of it. And so when it comes to representation, talking about historical times, I think you're right. Like, I think he's kind of making a concession for the truth of the times. But at the same time, I almost never say this. The book would probably be stronger without it because it's handled so clumsily. And I almost never think that. Like, 2004 just isn't that long ago for the way that this was handled. And I'm the sort of person who, if you're looking at like feminist theory through the times, I'm going to look at a story like Landval, which, if you don't know, really quick, is just like part of the King Arthur canon, where a woman who's a queen of another court is able to save her people by undressing in front of King Arthur and the queen. Kind of at first she didn't want to, and then she gives in to it to save her people because it's what's in her power to do it, to impress the court there, and in doing so saves the lives of her people. That was female empowerment because she was able to be a major character, and two, make a choice to be the hero. If you read it now, wouldn't quite fly that way. But at the time, it was a huge step of progression. I recognize that and I understand that. But 2004 is way too late to be like, well, there was a black guy somewhere and he was a hero, but it was rough. Like, no, it doesn't.
Right.
It's
and in 2004, I think, I mean, I don't know what Darwyn Cooke was thinking, but I think that a lot of liberal white people in 2004 could think, hey, things are mostly better and we're headed in the right direction. I mean, we weren't at Barack Obama yet, but there might have been a sense of, yes, we've gotten past the worst of these times. And now for the public who's now people like me who've seen more of what was hidden, thanks to social media and Black Lives Matter, we don't feel such an optimism that everything is necessarily going in the right way.
I mean, I guess, but I'm also like, this guy could have walked down the hall and talked to Dwayne McDuffie to make sure he was doing this sort of thing right, and didn't,
That's true.
And or a number of other like milestone creators. Just like he had access to do better and he didn't here.
Yeah. Well, he was struggling with the writing, really. He kind of tries to cover it up, but he was struggling. He was like, how do I fit all these different things together? Mm-hmm. I think what he did do well is give you a very strong sense that all these people in this sort of Frank Sinatra world are actually damaged goods. They're all wrecks from World War II. Yeah. They're all, or the Korean War in the case of Hal Jordan. So their slick, go get 'em gung ho-ness is a cover for the wrecks that they become because of wartime experiences.
Which is funny, and again, why I think the Flash is such a kind of important character in this book, because I think that veneer and all that you're talking about, I believe, but I don't believe the Flash is any of that. He looks like a loaf on the couch till he gets up to run and save the day, but he's also kind of like a puppy dog to his girlfriend. Like, his personality is so offset from everyone in the book. He feels like a different kind of man almost. And so...
Well, and they don't do that. Did he go to war? I don't know if he did.
No, he's only ever really been a superhero, but he's also a superhero against the law in that case because he knows it's the right thing to do. So I feel like that's why, as we're going through this, like the Flash's presence is felt in this book even when he isn't there necessarily, because he's like this odd counterweight to so much of what you're talking about in a good way for both ends. It's a character that really uplifts the book, even though he's not in really that much of it. And I'm looking at the ending here. Green Arrow shows up.
Right.
Cool.
Right. I mean, I think that takes us back to the fan service. We just see so many characters and only a few of them are really explored, but we get a cool scene here and there. You know, Green Arrow does a little bit of cool archery work, and
well, and I almost appreciate that more, right? Like, he didn't really have anything for Green Arrow to do, so he threw him at the end for the big to do, because I think he's mentioned slightly beforehand, and then, you know, he's summoned to fight the big bad. And he's needed because he's part of the JLA that we're building to, but there you go.
Another thing, when I think of myself as a reader between then and now, you know, going in deep, really maybe for my third or fourth time on superheroes in the past 10 years, I've become more and more against big events and gatherings of large heroes. I prefer, you know, like my favorite comic recently at DC was Hawkman, when it just was exploring Hawkman and not when it was connecting him up with the Justice League or big events in the DC universe. And so I personally, as a reader, have moved away from this whole idea of big universal events. And I think that's maybe a common thing for us older readers. I see people come back to comics all the time. They dive into some events and then they start complaining about them, and then they start looking for the smaller books to read, I think.
It's funny because I just dived into an event from 1989, I want to say, Inferno.
And an event I know nothing about.
Yeah, well, I didn't really either. And it was handled shockingly differently. There's kind of 3 tracks going on that all loosely tie together, but it's more an event in that there's kind of this period of time where all this stuff is happening and a lot of characters are loosely affected, and then there's kind of the main books dealing with it. But like, it's an X-Men event, but there's more Spider-Man books than there are New Mutants books that's like one of the main tracks and all that. It's this whole crazy thing, but it was handled very differently. And a big part of that is how the creative through line happened at Marvel in those days versus the more corporate offices now, or how it was ever handled at DC. And it's interesting how, if I was reading any one of those books, just getting the Inferno books through whatever books I was reading, if you were doing it that way, would be perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Except with one kind of exception, I think.
So they structured it loose enough so that the individual writers could just tackle it in a way that worked best for them and not let it derail their stories. Is that what you mean?
Well, yeah. So like, Marvel is effectively in New York. And so this thing is happening in New York and the characters are going through what they're going through, but also this thing is happening that may or may not have a major part of the issues that actually tie in, which is compelling and worked. And like, in the Power Pack, it's a big deal. In the Fantastic Four, it's barely mentioned.
Right.
But to tie back to this, like, this is a giant event, you know, this is the new frontier. It is this decade spanning event. And I think this is a better way to handle a big story, is to not tie it through every book that's trying to keep its own momentum going, but to have the big event, keep it in its own book and tell this big story.
Right.
And then let your other stories go.
Yeah,
I know
that's
it's
true.
crazy.
I mean, this looks like an event, but it's not the event comic that actually affects the current continuity and current events in every book.
Yeah, this is technically one of the multi-Earths, right? Like, this isn't canon.
It's not canon. Yeah, I don't think at this point they would identify it as not being Elseworlds or anything.
Right.
But in that feeling, there's various story threads in here. I just wished for more of them. Like I wanted to follow through with even more of the Martian Manhunter's experiences. And I don't, even though the Martian Manhunter started in the Detective Comics in 1955, I don't feel like I can go back to those comics and get more of these experiences with the Martian Manhunter and King Faraday and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I wonder how much was in that original stuff and how much is kind of retrofitted, as with most of this comic, for the characters we're more familiar with. But I will say Martian Manhunter was a standout character here. And one of the standout moments was between Batman and the Martian Manhunter being the two Gothamites.
Yeah.
With Batman basically laying down the law with him. Like, he's willing to work with him, but he says, if you do this thing I don't want you to do, I bought this, $1 million rock to deal with the one in Metropolis. With you, I just need a penny for a book of matches. And it's like,
right.
All right. It's, I think, the best line in this book, because I don't think I saw one recap or anything without it.
Well, it would be fun to have a continuation where we see more of Batman's adventures as a sort of stay in the shadows vigilante who is completely working illegally and had to, who secretly is friends with Superman, and Superman set up a fight where it looked like he could beat him.
You're right, Damian. What DC needs is another Batman book.
No.
On the money.
But as I read this, I want to read more of the it's like getting scenes from a world of comic books that you don't have.
Right.
An alternate. Anyway, I guess that's what any Elseworlds kind of book would be. You briefly get. But the tapestry here means that you get glimpses. Maybe that's a bit like being a kid reading comics back before you could get all the issues.
Right.
And you could imagine a much better continuous universe than there actually was, either at Marvel or DC, when you only read bits and pieces and you knew they were all connected and you kind of connected them in your imagination a bit.
Right. And one thing that is odd about this book is that there's no superfluous use of a character in a costume, right? If they're in superhero mode, that moment's going to sing stronger than the other two around it, with the set piece moving and whatnot, because that's all done by people in suits or people in military garb chatting or shooting.
Superhero moments are purely climax. They're purely, the delivery of the final moment of either a large portion of the story or of the final bit of the story.
I mean, we signify the entry of the third act when Hal Jordan actually puts on the ring and gets the costume.
Right. But even when he first gets the costume, he decides not to wear it. And his main use of the ring is to power his jet.
Right.
So it's only when he's being swallowed by a giant monster and needs to rescue other people being swallowed by a giant monster, they finally sort of reveals himself. Reveals the Green Lantern as a superhero that the world might see.
Well, yeah, and I feel like there's like a generation age thing here. So it's the thing that pushes him to let go of the last generation and move to being the superhero, this new generation. Right. Even though superheroes were there before, but he's part of the New Guard, right? And I feel like the New Guard is what there's kind of a match for everyone. So Martian Manhunter, Green Lantern, and Flash, and I guess Green Arrow, but it's, I don't know, it's interesting there. Yeah. So,
and also as nice, nice playing to the fans or the deep readers is characters that haven't even yet become superheroes on these pages are there, like what's the name of the guy who becomes the Atom? His technology becomes unstable technology becomes very important. But
Turtle Boy's in here.
He doesn't. Is Turtle Boy here? Anyway, and a lot of stuff just wouldn't make sense if you didn't know the lore. Like when in the background the guardians of Oa, kind of their faces appear in the background behind the Green Lantern. That wouldn't make any sense to you if this was your first superhero book.
Right.
Yeah, I'd kind of love to know what the thoughts of someone who's never read superhero comics and someone tells them this is a great book to start with would think.
Oh, I can't imagine anyone saying that. There's so many great books to start with. This is not one of them.
Well, I can imagine myself accidentally including this in a list, maybe along with some others, for someone who said they were superhero curious, because I remembered it being such a smoother read than it actually is.
Okay.
But I think the ideal reader of this, as we've been saying, is the hardcore comic book superhero aficionado, especially of DC.
Right. Any other?
I think that's pretty much all I can think of. Yeah. Now that I'm liking it again, I was starting to dislike it at points as I was reading it. And then by the end, I liked it again. But I kept shifting my thoughts of what I thought I was reading.
Well, I feel like the last act, the last third is the strongest of the book.
Right. It's where you finally get the gang together.
Right. And I guess we should mention, I'm kind of curious what you thought of the ending with Kennedy's speech.
I didn't really like that.
Okay.
Because it tied back into the racism. It showed the grave of John Wilson, aka John Henry. Mm-hmm. It showed Lex Luthor. I don't know. I don't have this Kennedy worship.
But you didn't like the presidential connection between Luthor and Kennedy?
I didn't totally make it that way, and I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I liked the drawings, but I could see how it was clever to put a real speech by John Kennedy up against these pictures from the DC universe and have it kind of make sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess Kennedy was an inspirational speech maker. I was too young to ever appreciate that, and I think by the time I got old enough to look into things like Kennedy, I already had kind of an anti-baby boom kind of feeling going on in my heart.
Gotcha. Okay.
And technically, I am a member of the baby boom, but I always thought of myself as more Generation X.
Well, aren't you nifty? I have to be a millennial.
You're stuck with it. Well, you will prove that millennials are not what some old farts think they are.
Well, we're the old farts now, so there you go.
Somewhat old farts, yeah. But
getting older every day.
It's too bad that Darwyn Cooke died, because it would have been nice to see more superhero comics from him.
Did he do much? Because I'm trying to think of his other works. Like he did the Parker books.
Right, and he was moving further away from superheroes, actually. But I'm fantasizing that if he lived long enough, he would. Everybody comes back at some point.
Well, I imagine he would have. I'm just trying to remember what else he did.
He did some Watchmen books. He did some before Watchmen books. And he did some Catwoman and what else did he do? I know he did some other things. I think he did do a Batman series. What was it called? It was like a one-word name. I feel embarrassed now for not remembering all this Darwyn Cooke stuff. And then he did a lengthy, well, not a lengthy, but a good run on the DC's version of the Will Eisner's The Spirit.
That's the one
Batman Ego he did. And then he did Catwoman with Ed Brubaker. And he went on to write a graphic novel called Selena's Big Score.
I thought that was a Jeff Loeb Tim Sale joint.
Not according to this.
Well, I was wrong. I should check that out.
Yeah, he drew a graphic novel called Twilight Children, which I read, which was written by Gilbert Hernandez, which
Huh.
the art on that was better than the story, even though I often like Gilbert Hernandez. But
Yeah, they can't all be winners.
yeah. So yeah, I think it's a deep cut. You know, if you love comic book art and you love superheroes, it's definitely worth it. Unless the only kind of comic book art you like is Jim Lee, because it's kind of the opposite of the Jim Lee stuff. But
I don't think anyone only likes Jim Lee.
Well, somewhere I'm just trying to place it. You know, it's
no, that's fair.
If you like this kind of retro style that evokes the Silver Age, then you'll like it.
There you go.
So you had talked to me about what you thought we should read next, and right at the moment I'm blanking on what it was, but I said yes, it sounded good.
All right. Next time on Never Stay Dead, continuing our talks from the works of the minds of their day, Frank Miller and Chris Claremont.
Yes.
I decided we should revisit their one true collaboration, the not actual continuity origin, but the true like birth of the character known as Marvel's Wolverine.
The 4-part miniseries called...
Yeah, which we'll read like 8 issues, because that thing's...
Is it?
Packed.
Okay. I've reread it once
comic.
or twice, but it's been a long time since I've reread it, so we'll see.
It's also a Claremont comic, so it's got a little extra verbiage in there. Yeah, and it's been a while.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. And it'll be like our 6th time doing something X-Men related, I think.
Sorry, I'm just on a thing.
It's not all you. I've picked X-Men stuff too.
Yeah.
We're becoming the X-Men podcast. By default.
Well, it's okay. We'll work in some more Spider-Man, right? That's the counterbalance.
I've been eyeing other X-Men stuff. I don't know if it's any good, but I'm going to dive into the miniseries Magic.
Oh,
or Storm and Magic, I guess it's called.
It's really Ileana's story. Storm's there, but for a bit. I'd love to do that with you too. That's a book.
You recall it being worth talking about?
Oh, it's compelling. It's also...
Well, why don't we make it that my next pick afterwards?
All right. Well, we might have to crank these out a little more regularly than we normally do.
In my mind, that came out a few years after the Wolverine miniseries, or was it quite a bit after? I can't.
Oh, it was before.
Really?
So
before
the Magic miniseries takes place before New Mutants, because that is the story in which Ileana goes from basically a baby child to a surly, I'm going to say early teen. With all of her stuff, which she enters the New Mutants earlier. Wolverine doesn't happen until the X-Men are more established later, and we're kind of in or around the Yukio story in Uncanny X-Men.
Be rude, but I think you must have that wrong.
Well, maybe. Well, let's find out. I swear I'm right, because how could I be wrong? Magic Comics, Okay, 1983.
Oh, maybe
for Magic. And then let's see if I can find this toot sweet here. Oh, come on. Oh, shenanigans. 1982 for Wolverine.
So they were very close together.
They were, and Wolverine was first. You're right. I was wrong. And so...
I had a memory that Wolverine was one of the very first miniseries I can remember coming out from Marvel.
I'm pretty sure it was. I just, for whatever reason, I thought Magic was earlier, but they're both very early. And I know why.
Why?
Because after Claremont took over X-Men and it slowly rose in sales, it quickly became Marvel's top seller. And so they were looking for ways to expand, but Claremont had a hold on it, and he didn't want anyone else playing with his toys, basically.
Yeah.
And so he's able to hold off the inevitable spin-off problem by doing these minis for a while, building out these characters and doing these things with little micro events. And that sated Marvel for a handful of years.
Lust for more sales.
Until he was able to kind of waylay them with the New Mutants, which kept that going for a while.
Right.
And then when X Factor hit, that was the first big Marvel betrayal on Claremont, not just because they handed off the book to another creator, but because they brought Gene back, which he was explicitly promised to by the head editor that they wouldn't do.
And in 1982 is when God Loves, Man Kills came out.
Yeah.
So that was probably another attempt to like him stay in control, but give them more X product.
Yeah, and that was part of the graphic novel series, right? So that was
he might have kicked
more
off
in
the
line.
series. I'm not sure.
That doesn't sound right. So
It's the 5th graphic novel. You're right. Actually, I think what might have kicked off the graphic novel series was a Jim Starlin book, The Death of Captain Marvel.
that sounds more right.
Yeah, that was the first one.
Hold on.
Look at my screen. You can see it was the first one.
I know. I'm looking at my own thing. So yeah, the Marvel graphic novel series is all over the place. So then it goes to Elric, and then there's Dreadstar, and then there's the New Mutants introduction, and then there's God Loves, Man Kills, and then bunch of nonsense.
So Chris Claremont was working hard, and I think it was good for it to stay as long as possible under his control.
Yeah, the way he left, I learned more about, and that was tragic.
Now you're talking about his battles with Jim Lee and all of that.
Yeah, when he left in '94. But I mean, it couldn't have been too bad in some ways because he comes back.
Well, in comics, everyone comes back, either from death or from retirement.
Well, he never retired, right?
Well,
like,
you know,
back to
either they say they're never going to write for Marvel again, and then they come back, or they're never going to. I mean, you see it over and over. Jack Kirby came back to Marvel. Steve Ditko came back to Marvel.
Well, I don't think Steve Ditko ever said he wouldn't.
Well, maybe not. I thought he did when he quit back in the 60s. But then in the late 70s, he was in the early 80s, he was there cranking out product for Marvel, not very enthusiastically.
The book that is the most bizarre to me that he did, which actually is probably less of an issue for him to do, was the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers comic he did for like a couple
I
of
had no
issues.
idea he did that. Wow.
I want to buy those. Like, I'm sure they're atrocious, but I just want to see it.
He shows up in all kinds of weird places, like doing the Micronauts and ROM and Captain Universe.
Have I told you my fun fact about that ROM issue?
No. What fun fact about it?
In one of the ROM issues, there's a Marvel ensemble, and it's the only other time he drew Spider-Man.
Wow.
Except for his own little fan comics, which he had done in his studio that some people know existed but never saw the light of day. And at this point, I don't think they're ever going to.
I know it's against what Steve Ditko wants, but I want all kinds of things to see the light of day.
Oh, everybody wants his... yeah, everybody wants to just like, dude, just publish that stuff. He's dead. Yeah. Who cares? Let's do it. Like, and frankly, yeah. Break his wishes. Like, come on,
it's for history.
Do it. It's not just for history. I just want to know, like, and I don't care that he didn't want to see, because he didn't want people to see it for the dumbest reasons. He had a lot of things in his head about the way people perceived things that was dead wrong.
Right.
I feel qualified to say that, having read a number of essays published in his final years and whatnot, and just thinking like, dude, you are way too wound up, which is a huge part of what makes you who you are. But like, You did the work, man. I want to see it. I'm sure it's interesting.
I mean, now that he's dead, it's history. It's not just his personal.
Well, he's not that dead.
I mean, I'm offended by stuff that's done when people are alive, but I mean, this is a completely different subject. But I hate when they make one of those dramas based on real life, on the real life of someone who's still alive. I mean, right now they're doing it about Trump and some streaming service or something, but
It's okay. He's not long for this world. He has COVID, so
I think he's going to survive that, unfortunately.
it's just improved.
Not all this stuff is not going to be in the podcast.
Oh, dang.
In fact, I think on that note, I'm going to say good night, everybody.
Good night.
Matt and I can talk in secret, where we talk about Trump wearing diapers and being a superhero. But see, that's the kind of conversation that's going to remain private, like Steve Ditko's personal drawings of Donald Trump naked.
Oh my God.
I'd love to know what Steve Ditko thinks of Donald Trump, since he believes in black and white. Anyway, we're still live. I haven't pressed end podcast yet. So we will be back. We will not die, or we will die and we will rise again. See you, Matt.
See ya soon.